Hi everyone, good evening and welcome to the third of our Women Who Changed the Discussion series presented by Movement and Skill Acquisition Ireland. Movement and Skill Acquisition Ireland is comprised of Ed Collin, Phil Carney, Alan Dunton and myself, Ollie Logan, and we are passionate about skill acquisition, coaching science and youth development. And we hope that by hosting these webinars, we're able to connect you with some of the leading figures in these respective areas. So some of you may be aware we ran our first webinar series from April to June of this year, and you can check all of those videos out on our YouTube channel, which you can see just down the bottom right there. That's MSA Ireland. And our first speaker in that series was a lady called Sarah Kelleher, and she's a former Ireland field hockey captain and current England under-18s coach. And Sarah, in the lead up to that webinar, when she did an interview for the Irish Examiner, she spoke passionately about the need for greater efforts to raise the profile of female coaches in an interview. She said we need more stories, more voices. And, you know, speaking with the rest of the team here in response to Sarah's call, we've decided to go with the theme, Women Who Changed the Discussion, for a second season to promote the great work of female academics, researchers and practitioners in the field. We're also really fortunate to be supported in this series by the 2020 campaign here in Ireland. And 2020 by 20 has 3 targets to reach by the end of this year. And that's 20% more media coverage of women in sport, 20% more female participation at player, coach, referee and administrative level, and 20% more attendance at women's games and events. And hopefully through the push through this series, we can encourage more people to get more females to get involved in research and be practitioners and be academics, certainly in the areas of skill acquisition. For those of you in this webinar on Zoom, can I just ask you keep yourselves on mute, and if you do have questions, please put them in the chat box down at the bottom and we'll monitor those and pick those up after the presentation. If you are watching on YouTube live, then please put any questions in the comments box. And again, we'll pick those up and ask those of our presenter after the presentation. So that's it from me. I'm going to hand over to Phil and he can introduce our speaker for tonight.
Thank you, Ollie. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Laura Finnegan. Laura is a lecturer at Waterford Institute of Technology, where she leads the Football Research Group. The group consists of a mixture of Department of Sport and Exercise Science lecturers and national and international experts in football research. The group has a wide range of expertise in the areas of talent development, organizational structure in football, player migration, transitions, and coaching. The group has been designated as the official research partner with the Croatian Football Association, and Laura is also a presenter on the UEFA Pro License program delivered by the Croatian FA. I've got to say, I do like your strategy, Laura, of working on programs closer to Adriatic beaches than to Irish sea beaches. It's a very nice move. Laura may be familiar to many from her blog, Talent Development in irishfootball.com, and from her appearances in national media. If you haven't come across the blog, I thoroughly recommend it and we'll include a link in the description. Laura completed her PhD in Talent Development in Irish Football through Liverpool John Moores University, and we are delighted to have Laura sharing today some of the findings from that research and leading a discussion on the implication of her findings. Over to you, Laura.
Thanks, Phil, and thanks to also to Mark, Ed and Ollie as well for the invitation here this evening. Yeah, as they mentioned, I'm going to go through background a little bit to my PhD, a little bit about the theoretical background, because to me that's really important to situate my thinking about the PhD before I started. And then we look at some of the different areas that it covered, some of the quantitative work, qualitative work, and the longitudinal study as well. Finishing off with thinking points and some future plans as well. I was working in academia and an interest in football. The idea of doing a PhD is always close enough to the surface. And after trudging home very despondent from the 2012 Euros, it solidified in my mind that a talent development PhD was the way to go. A common criticism of talent development insights and approaches is the focus on one part or subset of development rather than this whole landscape of development. So for me, that was really important to try and have as broad an approach as possible. An approach that would look at culture, environment and stakeholder relationships and really provide as much as possible a multi-layered analysis. So I began that in conjunction with Liverpool John Moores University. Three main areas to the study. There is the demographics of the FAI's primary talent development mechanism, at the time the Emergent Talent Programme, which consisted of 12 regional centres. And that provided additional training for, at that stage, up to 2,000 boys. So quantified all of that and looked at it in terms of relative age effect, place of birth, and internal migration as well. We looked at, assessed the talent development practices of all stakeholders and looked really at how governance structures and practices, how that influenced talent development. So what did it look like actually on the ground, and what were some of the repercussions of some of those relationships? Lastly was a longitudinal study which involved following 5 boys that were on the Irish under-15 team at the time for the next 5 years throughout their development. In terms of the background and really where I was at in terms of coming up with ideas for the PhD, it led me to Yuri Bronfenbrenner's early work on education and child development, and it's the idea of an ecological model. And he presented it like this initially, that the developing athlete or child is at the middle of these nested structures and are influenced by these different levels, right from the microsystem, which are people and organizations that the child interacts with on a daily basis, right out to the macro system, which is more to do with overarching governance, institutional systems, kind of political, and everything that's a manifestation of underneath. What I really like about Bronfenbrenner is that he didn't just sit in his laurels there, he actually kept refining his own model until eventually he updated it and said, actually, I've made a mistake here. This nested structure is only one part of it. Really, he suggested that he underplayed the power of the individual there to influence their surroundings as well. So it wasn't just things happening to the individual, but they had more of a role to play on that as well. So to me, I found that really important, that idea of keep reflecting on the models that he was using and updating those mental models, I suppose, as he went along. Henriksen is a Danish sports psychologist who utilised this nested structure from Bronfenbrenner to produce this structure that you see on the screen, and his athletic talent development model, where he incorporated lots of Bronfenbrenner's elements in terms of the concept of time in there as well, and how past actions, maybe by governance structures, influence what's happening right now. And you can see he's utilising things like the micro and the macro environment, but I suppose for a sporting context. So essentially all of these things influence your talent development environment. So there's 2 that I'm just going to have a quick look at this evening. The first one being that specific sport culture. And to me, that was really important. Like, what are some of the cultural, the dominant norms within football? So I used that emergent talent player data to try and unpick some of that. The first one was along the lines of the relative age effect. As was said, this is available on the blog in a bit more detail, but you can see there the percentages from those born across all the 12 months, right from almost 14.5% in January down to 3.1% in December. So it does mirror a lot of other football and research with that age group as well. Interestingly, the CSO data that we fill in every few years, that actually has birth rates as pretty constant across the 4 quarters. But you can see that those representative and being selected onto the Emergent Talent Programme weren't representative of the general population norms, from almost 40% in Q1 down to 12.5% in Q2. Interesting to pick down on that a little bit further as well. When we looked at some of the most successful underage teams in terms of winning SFAI Cups at under 13, under 14, they produced some of the largest figures that I had seen in academia to that point as well, in terms of almost 80% born in the first half of the year across a few of these squads. That was consistent across provinces. It was consistent across each of the schoolboy leagues as well. Different size effects across them, but it was there and consistent across them as well. Something else we looked at was the place of birth effect. Cote and MacDonald have led the way in this type of research, that trying to identify, are there characteristics about specific places of birth that make it more likely for you to get selected onto specific squads. They talk about almost a sweet spot in terms of a place of birth not being so small that it doesn't have access to particular resources, but then again, not being so big that you're a very small fish in a very large pond. I had access to home counties, so we were able to see in relation to where those 12 centres are, where the players were actually coming from. And there was a couple of really interesting points that came from that as well, that you're 50% more likely to gain access to one of the development centres if you had one in your county. So it raised questions to us in terms of, well, you know, potential of existing biases. Again, we're trying to unpick the culture of what's actually happening on the ground there as well. The darker the colours there, you can see that in terms of kind of relative population, they were the most heavily represented counties. There's some interesting ones there as well. We looked at, even though there are 2 centres, or this research has done, there's 2 centres in Dublin, but actually they were, relative to population, actually quite underrepresented. The feeder numbers per centres varied significantly across the country as well, with much more boys kind of fighting for places in Leinster than in other provinces. So what did that tell us? Well, we looked at, was there equal access to these types of development pathways? No, they're influenced by both population density and by the location of the centres as well, which was quite interesting. So there was a place of birth effect there. The third thing I was able to do with that data was actually use it to try and chart internal migration patterns. And this was quite unique. There's quite a lot of research that will look at transnational migration patterns in sport, but very little that looks at internal migration patterns. As you can see in the graph on the right there, again, the counties are all different colours. The darker the colour, the higher number of boys were migrating out of that county and in towards the mecca at the time of youth development, being the Dublin District Schoolboy League. No other league really identified, no other league had any significant patterns of movement except the DDSL in terms of inward migration. So again, we're able to see things, well, actually, boys from Dublin, for example, in the last conversation said that there's more of them fighting for places, but actually not only is there more of them, but they're more likely to be fighting against people from other counties as well. So it's making it a lot difficult there. You can see that there is an outward curve in that as well. Obviously enough, the counties that made it easy enough for travel for parents, because these were 14, 15-year-olds, then they were more likely to migrate into this core. Again, kind of why, like what's the issue there? It raises questions about the concentration of resources, because generally that leads to a concentration of power. And then we'll talk a little bit about stakeholder analysis, and something that's really impacted on talent development in Ireland is this power and ego down the years. So we can see straight away there that actually players were seen as assets essentially, and there was almost this asset hoarding in one particular schoolboy league. I referred to it as a double drain. So players were going to the DDSL to seek enhanced exposure to UK scouts predominantly. So it meant this double movement or transition. Again, it posed the question of, well, if this internal migration and club movement was a pattern of football development within Ireland, where's the supports for that? Where is that within the pathway? Where are the boys being supported to get this help with migration and transitions? So there were a few things that we looked at in terms of the sporting culture and looking at some dominant cultural actions and these resilient cultural beliefs. Well, okay, is it an emphasis on maturity and enhanced relative age effect? Will suggest yes. And what is it that's underpinning this? Was it early competition pathways, this kind of almost at the race to the bottom? did the place of birth, did it illuminate any existing biases in terms of coaches picking from pools that they were familiar with? And does it show us any blind spots as well? And migration patterns being so stark within the country, what does that tell us then about unequal resources and unequal access as well? To really try and account for and explain some of those patterns that I've just chatted about, I went about identifying the stakeholder relationships and trying to identify what impact do stakeholder relationships have on the talent development environment that the actual players are finding themselves in. To do that, for those that aren't familiar with Irish football, this is just a snapshot, I suppose, of what the governance structure looked like. It's a little bit changed now, but at the time, FAI Board of Management, and then you had the technically subordinate bodies like the Schoolboys Football Association, junior football, etc. So there was a wide range of interviews held with people from representing a number of those different bodies, including the individual clubs, schoolboy leagues, SFAI National Council Executive Committee, and the FAI as well. Tensions, it won't surprise anybody that's listening here for me to say that there were tensions across the football governance landscape. What were driving those tensions? Well, issues with leadership, board composition, political dominance, a sense of unfairness and lack of organisational justice as well, about how individual leagues were perhaps being treated and governed. I'll go through this really briefly, and structural resource inequalities then. So people on the ground, people at governance level were noting inequalities in relation to finance in leagues. They were noting inequalities in relation to access to scouting networks, both from UK academies who essentially would just base themselves in the Dublin District Schoolboy League, because they would talk about this migration, and it was really the culture of, well, if he's good enough, he's here already. We don't have to look any further than that. So that was helping to drive that inward migration. Also at the time, we spoke about the dominance of Dublin-based players on underage international squads as well. We also spent a lot of time looking at the governance perceptions of the fit for purpose nature of some of the competitive and performance structures. But really, what were the implications there? Well, the implications to this lack of cohesion and lack of kind of coordinated governance structures, poor communication practices, perceptions of inaccurate disclosures. We were told this, no, you were told this. Lack of decision making, it all had an impact on player development. One example that I have there was the impact of this on accepting the player development programme. If people are familiar with the PDP, which is what the FAI rolled out to try and harmonise or standardise playing all over the country, because up to then the SFAIs, the governing body for age 16 and down, could essentially of different types of leagues, different types of competitions happening in different counties. So to standardise or harmonise that, the FAI rolled out the player development plan. Some leagues wouldn't accept it, and interestingly, when we spoke to them, sometimes it was less to do with the actual minutiae of the plans or what it would mean, but it was more to do with, well, I'd like to get one over on X or Y. So that idea of we could have the most fantastic talent development plans and pathways, but they are buffered as they try and go through those levels that I showed earlier on, that kind of getting from macro to micro. So we need to talk about kind of stakeholder engagement there is really key. The third study was a longitudinal study, which I mentioned was following 5 boys, not any boys pictured there, for 5 years throughout their under 15 time with Ireland and on. Why did I think that was a really worthwhile piece of work was because not only did it give me an insight into their microcosm or their micro level, but also how these macro side of things, the cultures, these sport cultures that I've spoken about already, the sports federation and governance, how that impacts those boys on an ongoing basis at that micro level. I'd like to say at this point that the boys' paths diverged really neatly onto some neatly packaged pathways, but they really didn't. They went all over the place for the 5 years, and I think it's why the language is really important, that it's really hard for us to try and talk about player pathways, because really it was more about their individual journeys. And so we need to talk about how we support these individual journeys. And it does take a lot of resources. And it takes a lot of kind of thinking about that and the individualized nature of development. We know the development is not linear. So are the structures reflecting that as well? These were some of the things. Obviously, it's a 5-year study, so there are lots. I'm still making my way through it, really. But here were some of the key things that I pulled out from that I thought you might be interested in. The first one was actually the role of the GAA in there. It so happened that that was the other sport for 4 out of the 5 boys. One of the boys didn't play anything else other than football, but the other 4 were engaged with GAA in some context at least. Why I found this really interesting was that actually what came across really strongly, and you know, I'm loath to kind of talk about their journeys as kind of highlighting the only journeys, because, you know, I don't want to, we know the danger of the survivorship bias and just focusing on particular journeys. But for me, there were really interesting outcomes from this. The GAA one was that the boys actually really enjoyed their time with GAA. They enjoyed being able to go and do something different other than soccer or football. They were all engaged in League of Ireland underage pathways, but they saw being able to escape to the GAA as providing almost an arena of comfort to them, where they could renew, they could be revitalized as well, and they actually brought that confidence back into their underage League of Ireland as well. So for me, that came through really strongly there. We often talk about talent transfer in terms of more of a mechanical process, but here it was psychological. They were coming, you know, they might have been dropped from soccer at the weekend, but going and playing GAA, they got their confidence back and they came back refreshed and revitalized to play football. So that was one interesting point there for the longitudinal study. What I found was that the stakeholder relationships, so these governance interactions at that macro level, they were really felt acutely by the players. So they do permeate levels. One particular example was one of the boys was captain for the DDSL team down in the famed Kennedy Cup. And he remembers that animosity towards his whole team for the whole duration of the competition, purely because they were the Dublin District Schoolboys League, a representative of the DDSL. So that was felt really, really acutely by players. We saw earlier in the quantitative piece that, you know, migration and club migration was a common feature within these journeys. That begs the question then of the transition supports for players. So club movement is common, but we need to consider these coping mechanisms and transition supports. Where does that happen? We all differ in our ability to adapt to change. Some of us might see it as a loss of identity. Some might see it as an opportunity. So where do we talk to players about that? Bronfenbrenner again alludes to this kind of transitions and talks about that the trajectory is developed in your old setting. So for example, if you're a feeder club for League of Ireland, really that's where the trajectory for a successful migration starts. So generates in your old setting, and it's the balance between challenge and support in the new setting will determine whether it works and goes well or not. That's key. So we really should identify stressors in that process. Is it travel? Is it cultural change? One of the issues from the boys that was from outside Dublin, when he moved to a team in Dublin, he very much saw a big cultural split between Dublin boys and anyone from outside the Pale who was just collectively from down the country. So there was a real cultural shift in there as well. And he would allude to being able to identify boys with the GAA background because he felt it made them tougher and meaner. So even within that context, there were individual cultures. So where do we support and almost prepare the boys for that? Again, work of Slosberg and Stambolova is really important to have a look at there. These boys were, as I said, on the under 15 Irish squad, moved on to League of Ireland. Some of them were playing minor for their county as well. So I looked at, well, what was making them commit to football over GAA when that time eventually came for them to choose? What were some of the key decision-making factors around there? And really some of the things that came through quite strongly there was the importance of group affiliation. So again, that links back to some of the migration pieces that I spoke about already, and players finding the best fit, that balance of time consumption. And again, if they were faced with large travel times, that negatively impacted their view on that particular sport. So the balance of things like travel, but also the balance of satisfaction gained from participation, a desire to repeat enjoyable experiences, to use their skills, but also being able to maintain social relationships. For a lot of the boys that had experience in other sports, that was one of the big differences that they saw between football and the GAA were these social relationships. The GAA is probably boys that you've grown up with all of your life. So how, if you're a soccer coach, how do you try and maybe replicate that, particularly at a representative level? How do you give your team that satisfaction and make him or her feel bound in to that? Education came through quite strongly there as well. At the time, it was the League of Ireland under 17, so that was facilitated quite nicely by transition year, but now it's expanded to under 15 and under 13. There was a real shift in their attitude towards education as well. The younger ages, I think, linked to perceived competence as well, and they're being told that they're elite. So there was almost a sense of, well, I don't really need education because I'm going to be a footballer anyway. So how do we engage them with education and monitor that as well, I think was really important. Proximal processes are this kind of marrying of the graph that I showed earlier between the individual and their context, and it's what's happening there. It's all about these connections between the two. To be effective, they have to get more complex progressively through the development process. I suppose the ability of these processes to influence development varies substantially as both a confluence of personal character, remote context as well. And for me, what I took away from that is it really shows us that we can't just have a one-size-fits-all approach, because we can draw these fantastic pathways, but how I experience that pathway in my micro setting will be very different from everybody on this call. So we need to look at that individualization of approach, I suppose. And this developmental environment can have some disruptive aspects. So we mentioned the relative age effect and that propensity to focus on maturity, whether that be physical and social and cognitive maturity. Perhaps it's been hampered by a place of birth effect or other inequalities. but it can also be positive as well in terms of role models, individualized support. And there were examples of this as well, absolutely, and examples of coaches and teams that had this long-term focus. So what's the nature of those proximal processes? Left kind of the first to last, I suppose. The primary engines of development and family culture really principally determined the boys' engagement initially. That's in line with a lot of long-standing research, but how they interacted with the world and how they interacted with football was really generated by that initial socialization into football from, in this case, quite stereotypical lines. It was a male figure. Sometimes it was a father, it was an uncle, it was a strong male teacher in another instance. So generally along these stereotypical male lines. What was really interesting as well that came back, because I was, I suppose, immersed with families as well as the development, the boy themselves, was that actually being a parent of a youth footballer engaged in some of these pathways actually changed them as well. So, for example, parents were getting socialized into the football culture as well, that maybe was quite new to them. They also had, they saw this enhanced, I suppose, parental identity, which maybe leads to some of the scenes that we see on the sidelines. And also increased parental responsibility as well in terms of the time and positions for getting these players through, whatever representative teams and squads that they needed to go to. That was just a snapshot of some of the issues that arose over the 5 years. So for me, I was coming away with as many questions as I went in with, but the idea of, well, designing a learning environment and being cognizant of this macro to micro level influences, and how do we balance training, challenge, this psychological load. So for example, there's coping mechanisms for migration and transitions, and we might think, well, look, they're just moving maybe from this team into a team down the road. That's not going to put a substantial psychological load on them, but it is, and we have to prepare them for that as well. And also the social factors, and that was really somewhere where in that example, the GA did quite well. It gave the boys more of a sense of agency in some situations than football did. And there's a few examples of that where, for example, to get on the Kennedy Cup squad, boys were being forced to sign contracts at 13 or 14 to say that they'll only get their place in the Kennedy Cup squad if they promise to give that county another year without moving to the DDSL. So there was a loss of agency at certain times. From a coach perspective, maybe operating at that micro level, so you are those daily interactions or weekly interactions with the player. For me, it's what's the awareness of the overall holistic development environment of your athletes. Like what else is going on from those nested structures or circles, and how does that sporting culture permeate your coaching? Things like perhaps selection biases, like the relative age and place of birth. I've found quite strongly as a novice researcher that understanding those and having some data and being able to go to the research gave me confidence to challenge really dominant and resilient cultural beliefs as well. As an outsider researcher to this field, that really it helped my confidence for sure. In terms of administration side of things or stakeholders, it's really easy to assess the equality of access and opportunity to your particular field. It's something you could do. Awareness of your role as a stakeholder and the power in terms of stakeholder. I'm taking a bit from business research here, but they introduced the idea of a stake owner, and that would be somebody that's not the dominant. So you're not talking about the FAI, but you're talking about the SFAI, you're talking about individual leagues and clubs, and that actually shouldn't just be a top-down responsibility from the SFAI, but actually you have an important role to play here as a stake owner in developing this holistic context. An awareness of the non-linear nature of development that we mentioned, and do the current structures, I suppose, accommodate this. my graph that showed all these varied journeys and pathways. Do we have flexible systems that keep boys that maybe didn't make the Irish under 15 squad at the time, or it's under 14 now? How do we keep them in the system? And again, that learning environment that we'll come back to, how do we balance that challenge for those, not just the ones that maybe because they're focusing on maturity don't make that initial top 20 at that age? How do we keep them engaged and involved? There's some of the work that's come from that quick little snapshot. The links will be put up on the chat there. I'm happy to send anybody these papers as well. The first one looked at the place of birth and the relative age. The second one spent more time on that stakeholder analysis, which I think is really important because it does permeate anything that we're trying to do within youth football in Ireland. And the third one there looks at player migration. Next steps, as I mentioned, we have a football research group underway. We're always looking for more participants. So if I'm sure you have something to add, please get in touch with me. My details will be at the end of the PowerPoint here. Some things, even from what I've mentioned already, that struck a chord with me. I think a bit more work in that arena of comfort, as we said, like what can the GAA actually, and any other sport, provide for our developing footballers, that they aren't just silos, that actually there was a really strong crossover in terms of benefits there. I think that's really important. Identifying patterns. Now, if you've sat through the laborious process of filling out FAI net, now suddenly the governing body have access to a full overarching analysis of player data, which didn't exist before. So now, instead of looking at a snapshot of relative age effect, we can actually look at it from initial playing ages. So, we can see actually, well, does it actually happen at 7, 8, 9, or where does it come out along the pathway? And that will help us to understand it a little bit more. And then it will help us to see, well, where does it need to go in terms of coach education as well. Assessing maturity and looking at more flexible league structures, playing up or playing down. I think there's a really important conversation there to be had in terms of the Underage League of Ireland structures. Hopefully, again, we'll have some data to help with that conversation. Migration as well, we're looking at kind of the role of governing bodies. Here, I've kind of taken one of Carling's models on migration, and we've looking at applying that to football. So that's something that we're going to spend a little bit of time on over the next year or two as well. So that's me. It's a quick snapshot of some of the things that we've been touching on over the last few years in terms of that PhD, taking this holistic approach, looking at kind of macro to micro levels in as broad a context as was possible. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Laura. Ed, I see there's a number of questions that have come in on the chat box. So do you want to go over and you can start asking Laura some of those?
Yeah, absolutely. Laura, thanks a million. That's great. Now, I'm familiar with your. It's been a great source of conversation for me with students in recent years. But I'm going to go straight to Jan Verbeek from the Dutch FA, who has got a great question he'd like to ask you directly. So, Jan, if I could ask you just to unmute there and then just fire away with your question.
Yes, thank you, Ed. Thank you.
You just need to unmute, Jan. Try again.
Yeah, thank you, Ed. Thank you, Laura, for your presentation. I really like the perspective you took in your PhD study by looking at the specific culture surrounding Irish talent development in football. But it might be at risk to be, well, your findings might be too specific for that, well, culture you investigated. But what findings do you think you can generalize to maybe other sports and other cultures as well?
Yeah, I mean, this was a question that came back and forth from our supervisors as well in terms of that. I suppose what I thought at the time was, and I suppose still do, that really that it wasn't the point of interpretive research to give context and provide rich insights. They mightn't resonate, but I think the significance to local context was key. And suggesting that there has to be generalizability maybe belittles that a little bit. It was kind of focused on Irish football. I think there are general aspects that can be taken within the PhD. Too short to do it there now, but I gave quite a rich context background, so readers might be able to look at it and see, well, actually, okay, that resonates with us, or that's similar or not to our landscape. I think we all know that we can't copy and paste anything, but there's a few researchers out there that have used that in a couple of different settings. Simon Roberts from Liverpool, John Moores has used it as well in UK Academy football. I mentioned Henriksen as well in his Danish, a variety of Danish sports as well. So I think providing the context, showing that rich data will help the generalizability of the studies.
Very good. I have a question also from Richard Bowles, someone we know well at Movement Skill Acquisition Ireland. And he said he's a bit of background noise where he is, so I'm going to ask on his behalf. He's asked, do you know if any similar data has been collected on girls' experiences and participation? And I'm assuming probably, first of all, maybe in the Irish context, and then beyond that, Laura.
There hasn't been too much in the Irish context at all. It was I suppose, beyond the scope of the initial PhD of mine. It is an area that I'm really interested in, and I hope to be able to extrapolate that out a little bit now that we have the basis and almost that kind of context. But no, I don't know of much female research done in this field at all.
I have a question myself before I go to Phil. A few weeks ago, we had Rebecca Luthwaite with Gabrielle Wolf on, and one of the things she mentioned, which was almost a little shocking in one sense, was that it takes about 17 years for research to find its way onto the ground where it's been applied in the real world setting. And for fear of us waiting till 2037 before some of your findings find their way onto the football pitches around Cork, where we are, Munster and beyond, and the other 4 provinces, and be outside of Ireland, what are the things that you feel you would like, let's say, clubs first and foremost, as in coaches like ourselves, volunteer mums and dads, but also maybe the powers that be to maybe speed up that process from your findings getting onto the ground where they're going to have a positive impact on the lives of these young people?
Well, I do think it's really interesting that you talk about the dissemination of research, because I think that was really important. I remember my first publication, I kind of sat back waiting then for a whole barrage of questions and interest, and it just doesn't come. So that's what I started the blog, as you mentioned at the start of the piece, and I found that a really valuable tool for me to try and get some of that research out there in little bite-sized chunks. And in that, then, you know, we talk about we take the siblings piece, we look at the parents piece, relative age, we could break those all down, and they're just in a much more digestible bite-sized chunk. So I found that the engagement through that forum has been much greater than published articles. And they have their place. That was the academic currency that you almost need, and there definitely was a place for that as well. But forums like this will help that. In terms of key kind of salient messages, definitely the idea of time, of patience, of trying to keep the pool as wide as possible. Yeah, and it's really hard, but they are some of the really key things. I suppose appreciating the culture and not being afraid to challenge some of those norms as well is something else that I would always encourage. And just because we've always done it this way doesn't mean that we have to or we even should be doing it that way. As I said, for me, definitely, I got confidence from that kind of quantitative analysis from the start, that piece that I was able to then bring in to the rest of the studies, because there was that thread that led all the way through it. You know, that the 5 boys from the longitudinal were part of that data set and had experienced all of the topsy-turvy nature in terms of stakeholder relationships. So that was that really solid thread to it. But definitely time, patience, and an understanding of development and that non-linear nature of it is key.
I think that's fascinating, because the points you make there speak to 2 of our webinars from our first series, and both of them are probably the highest viewed ones for anyone who's maybe new to us, but to check out the YouTube channel, because Mark O'Sullivan and Dennis Horteen from AIK Stockholm are, some of their work is groundbreaking, simple as that, but also some of their contributions speak to that space of widening the pool, being more patient, and also the work of Jan Verbeek, who we've heard from already, and his colleague Jorg van der Brecken in the Dutch FA. Again, the same messages seem to be coming out from these different countries as well as our own, which is always fascinating to see. It's almost that the weight of evidence is making a very strong argument for us to listen better. I think, look, I'm going to move over to Phil, who has a question. So Phil, if you'd like to unmute and fire away.
I haven't got one question, Ed. I've got many questions, so I'm going to try and behave myself and limit the number of questions. Really enjoyed that, Laura. There's a huge amount in there. Thank you very much. One of the points that really resonated with me was when you talked about the boys went all over the place for the 5 years. So pathways isn't a great description because the journeys are so individual. I'm interested at the start of their journeys, at the start of your interactions with them. Did you get any insight into the picture that the boys had about what their journey was going to be like over the course of those 5 years? Did they have any idea about the non-linear nature of it, something like that? No,
and I wonder, is that a consequence of, you know, that we only see the highlighted journeys of one specific upwards path or curve? No, and it was fairly consistent with all 5 of them when I met them first when they were 14. And again, I'll forever be kind of humbled by just being allowed in to them and their family for the 5 years. It was an amazing experience. But yeah, they were very much of the point, well, we're here, we're on, as they would class it as themselves, and they were being referred to as their elite development pathway. So there is only one way for them. And I think some of them struggled when maybe they hit, and again, it lends itself back to some of Collins and McNamar's work about that rocky road and the importance of that as well. But some of them faltered at that kind of first hurdle. And some of them went back into the comfort and the agency that the GAA gave them. So there was different reasons where they kind of went their own way through the pathway. But even reflecting back on it now, it does raise the question of, well, what's success for those journeys? I mean, I know where they are now at 20-year-old men, but and luckily for me, and there's always the danger with the small sample size and longitudinal research is that it could have gone anyway. But luckily for me, you know, I had one turned out to be what would be considered almost poster child of football development here, captain of DDSL, on all underage squads, you know, had the move to the UK academy, whereas there was others that, you know, chose or, you know, felt that pull towards the GAA because they were getting more positive experiences there. So for me, they went all over the place. But there wasn't really an acceptance of, well, if I get off this pathway here, this formal pathway, there wasn't really much navigation back in there. They're probably more of an exception than the norm.
So I might just try and follow up with that one because I really liked the answer there, and the question of what's success for those journeys, I think is a really important one, and sharing the stories, so you know that people understand the range of stories that are out there. You mentioned kind of proximal processes, and you kind of, some of the examples you gave were very interesting there, but there was another example that you used which was about coaches. I think you are those daily interactions with the player, which I think is fantastic. Could you give us a bit more insight into any examples of those beneficial proximal processes that helped players with those transitions or helped players at the various stages to get the most out of those journeys?
Yeah, I mean, from us looking as outsiders looking in, definitely things like perhaps quality of coaching, the club resources, the strength of the league as well, even the play characteristics of the local environment, which was really interesting, and players could maybe add up their amount of or enhance their amount of general play in the sport depending on their environment, which was quite interesting. But in terms of their interaction with coaches, what came through really strongly, there was very few mentions of technical skill or tactical knowledge of coaches. It was all about the relationships that they had with coaches, and asking them as 18 or 19-year-olds to reflect back even on initial experiences. It was all about the coach that made them feel special and made them feel like they were really key to this. And again, that idea of it wasn't just the coach delivering drills or tactical knowledge, but it was about that two-way relationship, and they stuck really strongly with the boys and made an impression.
Fantastic. Thanks, Laura. I think I'll pass you back to Ed. I think there's a couple more questions after coming through.
Yeah, they're flooding in, actually, both directly and privately. So I'm going to go to Jason DeVos first. Jason is the Director of Development at Canada Soccer, and then we'll go to Daniel Watts, and then we'll go back to Jan Verbeek. So Jason, if you'd like to unmute there, that would be great.
Perfect. Thank you, Ed. Thank you, Laura, for the work that you're doing in this space. It really helps us to make informed decisions about policy when it's backed by research in this area. One of the things that we commonly come up against when we talk about changing the grassroots development environment is the argument that we've always done it this way, and that sort of cultural momentum that exists. I often say we select the best 8-year-olds to put them on a team together so we can win the Under-8 World Cup. It's a common belief at multiple levels of our sporting system in Canada. How do you combat that? How do you have a discussion with someone and explain to them that success at junior levels of sport does not necessarily translate, more often than not, does not translate to success at senior levels in sport? And then the other issue that you face is the younger that you select players, you're actually deselecting the others, and you're maybe not giving them an opportunity. How do you combat that with research?
I think you mentioned the volume of data helps as well, as you mentioned that there probably is a growing space between academia and that kind of practitioner approach, which a lot of people on the call here are filling really well. So I think a continuation of that it's not just seen as something that's happening over in this academic ivory towers, that it is having an impact on the ground as well in terms of the type and volume of data and research. Definitely for me, the idea, the concept that everyone has an opinion on football, I thought that was above everything. I think everyone has an opinion, everyone's entitled to their opinions. That's why something like having that quantitative data to be able to show and be able to facilitate a further discussion about, okay, right, you say that doesn't happen, but then how do we explain X, Y, or Z? So for me, that was a really powerful tool to just start the discussion on that. And I think it depends on the context. Maybe some countries are doing it from a top-down approach, and they're more they're informed that way, and it will permeate across all levels of maybe coach education. Other countries, it might need an opposite approach, where actually it is almost a growing momentum amongst grassroots coaches that actually, look, we can do a little bit better than that. Sorry, second question then.
Yeah, I was actually thinking just about Jason's question in the first place. I really like that, because even just the word combat, it feels like sometimes we're in a war. It does feel like we're fighting things when we're saying, well, are we not all in this for the betterment of the kids? And why are we fighting? Okay, I'm going to go to Daniel Watts. So Daniel, if you wouldn't mind unmuting, please, and asking your question. Thank you.
Thanks, Ed. Yeah, sorry, thanks, Laura. It's really, really interesting presentation. I was just wondering, is there any indication through your research that at least, well, all or at least most of the sort of prerequisites or variables have to be present in order for boys to make it to the latter stages or further in the game? And if so, is there one sort of really dominant variable?
I think oftentimes the variables that make those boys attractive, where we start making selection decisions at 14, 15, 16, probably aren't the variables that the boys that will translate to professional levels. They're often quite different things. In my experience anyway, they can be different. So for example, through just pure luck, the fact that your parents went through their growth spurt early, you've gone through your growth spurt early, and suddenly you've got advantaged along the different pathways. So if that's a variable that might be really important to a culture that does put a lot of emphasis on this physical maturity, but then later on it's more about resilience, it's more about those kind of psychological constructs like that, and your psychosocial ability to be able to deal with that. Is that your own experience as well?
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. In my own experience of coaching youth football across sort of multiple levels, it can vary across stages, but there's so many things that seem to have to come together at any given stage for things to kind of progress or go one way or the other. So yeah, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Fascinating. Thank you, Daniel. Moving to Jan Verbeek, who's got a question around proximal processes that I actually had in my head myself. So Jan, if you wouldn't mind just unmuting again and just asking Laura yourself.
Yes, Laura, I was just wondering if you could maybe provide an example of well, something you came across in your study, a proximal process that actually differed between players. So there was actually positive for one player, but more negatively affecting the development of another player. And were coaches aware of this? So did they know that they have to approach certain players a different way, or were they more like a one-size-fits-all coach?
One example was, so for example, the proximal processes are these interactions between the individual and their environment. And if we take deselection from a squad as be one example of an environmental context, the way that the individuals responded to that was quite different. There were some individuals that actually perhaps had some experience of that. And interestingly, that experience of deselection didn't have to come from football. It often came from different sports as well, which was really quite interesting, but it still prepared the player better for dealing with that in that particular context. Whereas there was other people that didn't have the coping mechanisms or skill sets to deal with this process of deselection. So that was just one example of these processes of something that happened in the environment, but I suppose the ability of the individual to deal with it differed across all levels. And the individual, I suppose, toolkit, maybe it can be your psychological construct. It can be other characteristics like your family background, your family resources, your ability to be able to travel further for for higher level representative squads. So all of those things had an impact. I didn't come across any great level of evidence to say that coaches were really aware of that or treated the boys any differently, dependent on their individual skill sets or their unique kind of package of characteristics.
Cheers. Thank you. Very interesting.
Yeah, it is very interesting. I'm just going to go to Alan, who has a question about the stakeholders and how we can help them make better decisions. Alan, if you don't mind unmuting there.
Yeah, thank you, Laura, for the presentation so far. It's fantastic. And one thing I kind of picked up on was your need to suggest that we almost empower our stake owners a little bit more. But what kind of popped to mind was a specific example from our own country, where there was a group that looked to use a 9-a-side under 11 and an 11-a-side under 12 format. which kind of would push against what we know about the relative age effect, and it would almost make that worse. So how do we support our stakeholders to make kind of more appropriate decisions still within the overarching FAI kind of platform?
Yeah, there's probably a few different answers to that. Like the first is definitely this kind of incongruent behaviors or governance behaviors have impacted on the talent development pathway for sure. All the data will show, and again from sport governance literature as well, will show that the more cohesive the environment, that the better it is for that developing athlete in the middle. So you have to try and make it, I suppose there's a few different ways. It's either by force in terms of, this is what leagues have to do, but probably should be your last resort. It's, again, showing best practice, showing steps to best practice then as well. So we have maybe this best practice model, achievable steps of how to get there, looking at the specific context to see, well, what's stopping people getting there. It might be resources. It might be that actually we can't afford to buy the new goals that we need to fit into this model. So it might be about looking at some of the constraints that they face as well. It's psychological. I think it's about empowering organizations as well and making them feel part of the process, which traditionally hasn't been the case. They were very much kept at maybe arm's length, or seen as a distraction. But it's about bringing everybody together under the umbrella, because as we see from these structures, they all have an impact on the centre, that individual in the centre.
Yeah, very good. I think we're going to Phil and then on to Ollie for a question. So Phil, I'll go to you if you wouldn't mind unmuting, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So really interesting responses. Even the questions that have been generated are fantastic. And I think this links to a comment that was popped into the chat as well. But you mentioned about the current structures, and the question you asked was, do the current structures accommodate the nonlinear nature of development? So what kind of structures would you say are the best fit that coaches, that clubs should be thinking about, that organizations should be thinking about to fit the nonlinear nature of development?
Probably people that would say that, why do we need structures at all, I suppose. But if we are talking about it, I think they have to be permeable. They have to be malleable as well. We can't have a situation that there's almost a Matthew effect, that if you lose out maybe at an earlier age, and it might just be the chance of maturation, that you lose your shot, that actually if you're not on it from point A, then you can't, or you're not seen as being able to progress to point B and C. So to me that's really key, that actually before we look at what they look like, but we talk about how they should operate as well. Again, what's the outcome of or how are we classing success as structures? And I think that's a question that I haven't had answered yet as well, about maybe even the new national underage leagues. Is it the amount of boys that are playing that will progress through them for National League of Ireland? Is it, is it UEFA coefficient ranking? Where are the metrics of success or betterment, should we say? How do we know if what we're doing is getting better? So to me, that was quite important as well. But yeah, structure, it's quite simple, and we've mentioned it before, but if we're able to keep as many people involved and everybody with access to the same resources, because we just don't know. I think Stephen Finn had a look at some of the analysis of Irish under 15 squads, and I think is it 5-10% of those actually make it to senior level. So maybe what we're looking at age 13, 14, 15 is very different from the end of this kind of pipeline almost of development. So we just don't know. So keeping the pool as wide as we can, particularly within our context, we don't have a very wide playing pool to be able to overlook these talents as well.
Great, thanks, Laura. And I think it's really nice that you're now talking about a source of data being there to maybe be able to get some better metrics as to what is success. So that's really exciting to watch that in the coming years. Thank you.
We have a question from Ali, and then we go have a question from Oisín O'Neill after Ali.
Great, thanks, Ed. Laura, you touched on this a little bit in your presentation, but I'm just wondering, what are the unique cultural and social aspects that are unique here within Ireland, and especially the island of Ireland, that the system has to be adapted and planned for, that just wouldn't apply, say, even in mainland UK, kind of over the water. And you mentioned a little bit around the GAA, where it was beneficial in some circumstances. You know, could be complementary, almost using a donor sport, as in Keith David's words. But I can also see how it could be conflicting. But then also, was there anything around the fact that within this island we have two, I suppose, representative football bodies, in the FAI and the IFA? Was there any conflicts there that you observed?
In terms of Ireland, I think it's the lack of professional structures puts a lot of onus on the FAI to try and develop its own structures. We don't have a professional youth academy situation like the UK would have. So that does push, it puts different emphasis on what the FAI almost need to provide, or the financial resources that clubs need to provide that as well. So I think that's really important. Obviously it's you mentioned GAA, and it kind of goes across a couple of your questions there, because the GAA wasn't just seen as another sport. It actually was a really significant cultural aspect within the country as well. And it was, the boys would often speak about, well, you know, my uncles won the county title, and that actually became more important to them, and that more significant cultural pull than maybe playing League of Ireland under 17 and 19, when that minor or League of Ireland question raised its head. I think that's probably becoming younger and younger now, which might change the dynamic between both. I mean, now essentially boys have to choose at 11 or 12 to get onto the League of Ireland under 13 pathway, so they probably don't have the same level of exposure to both sports. It's a really tricky balancing one for sure, and you know, any coach will say that, like, well, look, we want them 3 times a week. We've got 50 boys that will take his spot and will devote himself here. So how do we give that time to the GAA? So I think it is, yeah, it's really tricky. But I think even that, contemplating that actually they're not necessarily a sworn enemy, that they can have potential benefits there, was something that I took away from that for sure.
Yeah, really nice. I think that feeds into Oisín O'Neill's questions too. Oisín, if you wouldn't mind unmuting and firing away. Maybe he's gone, is he not? Oisín, if you're able to unmute there. Yeah, I can see you unmuted. I just can't hear you. That's all right. Let me, if I may, I'm not able to, unless anyone else can hear him. Maybe it's not just me. It's in the chat here, and as I said, it's a question. He said, brilliant presentation. Question about the benefit of involvement in the GAA for the boys. How can we encourage stakeholders to allow a shared approach in the development of kids across the different sports? And I suppose for fear of actually saying something, he didn't, but I think that suggesting that idea of maybe a shared approach from almost a community perspective, that it's for the goodness of the child and the community that someone is doing what they love, and rather than feeling like they have to pick one over the other.
We did an analysis in the ETP outside of this piece of research a few years ago that showed that 2/3 of participants played another sport, and the vast majority of that was the GAA. So, like, you know, it is a pervasive part of youth culture. I think there probably has to be a variation of approach in terms of levels. Like I think at a local level, it's really important for county boards to sit down with perhaps the local League of Ireland squad or management and talk about how it's going to look, talk about how training should look, not trying to put things on maybe the same evening because we know that's traditionally the evening that they pick, so this will force kids to pick one or the other. It goes back to some of the earlier questions about changing of culture, and that's it comes back to that as well, about maybe looking at evidence, looking at that actually if you can retain that positive experience with your sport, and again, if you're seen as maybe given a little bit of leeway, the boys appreciated that. They appreciated the autonomy that they got with the other sports, and in this example, it was the GAA, that the GAA actually, you know, they let them go off and play different sports. They let them kind of drift in when they needed to, and the boys really, really appreciated that, and it, I suppose, affirmed their appreciation for the sport, even if they went on and continued their soccer pathway. I suppose they still had such a positive appreciation of the GAA and would possibly come back then in terms of coaching and engagement with the sport. So at a local level, for example, I think it's about relationships and developing relationships.
Fantastic. Laura, thank you so much. I think we could go on and on, but we remember we promised that we would cut you at an hour or so. So thank you so much. The questions have been fantastic. The presentation has been great. It has been a huge pleasure to actually see and hear work that's been happening in our own country, but also how it can translate beyond here. I'm going to leave people with a kind of a question that Mark O'Sullivan has put in, and I think it's a very valid question for us all to go away with when we're asking ourselves, why do we seem to be having such general linear models, and yet we're hoping to find unique people? And I think it's something that we should all reflect on in the respective sports and areas that we are working in, either in a voluntary capacity or in a professional capacity, and wonder and question, are they a fit for what we're trying to do? Laura, on behalf of the guys at MSAI, thank you so much for this evening, and I really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's great. Well, thank you very much, Laura, and hope some of the decision makers are able to listen and take on maybe some of the implications from this research. Well, that's it from our third episode. Keep an eye on our Twitter feed at MSA Ireland for announcements of our next installment. Me and the guys have been speaking about this week, so really excited about the ones that are coming up in the next couple of weeks. So keep an eye on Twitter, and we'll hopefully see you all again soon. Have a good evening.